Hello and welcome to Orkney. My name's Tom Muir and I'm sitting here at Warebeth looking over the Hoy Sound towards the island of Hoy. Now I'm a storyteller and there are many stories from Orkney, old folk tales that go way back thousands of years. And one of them is about the Selkie folk. Now the Selkie folk are seals who can take off their skins and become human for a certain time. They can dance on the shore, but then they have to go back to their skins and be back in the water. Now there was a man who was just known as the Good Man of Westness. And people said that he was an old young man because he was so sober. He was a very serious person and very dismissive of love until the day he saw the Selkie folk. He was down at the shore when he heard the sounds of laughter. He saw it came from a group of people who were playing around the shore, and they were all naked. And next to them lay a pile of sealskins. Now some were lying on the flat rock next to the deep sea, sunning themselves, and others were playing by the side of a shallow pool. He crept up to the side of the pool, and then he sprang up to his feet and he ran as fast as he could, and he grabbed one of the sealskins. Now the other Selkie folk, they got up and they ran off to their skins and they pulled them on and dived into the sea as seals again, all except for one girl, the girl whose skin the man had in his hand. He turned around and walked away with it. And as he walked up to his home, he heard the sound of sobbing behind him. He looked and it was a young woman. It was the Selkie woman whose skin he had stolen. And she begged him and she pleaded him with many tears to give her back her skin. But he refused. She was so beautiful. He did feel pity for her, but he also felt love, something he'd never felt in his life before. And he insisted that she had to marry him, and she was in no position to refuse as long as he had her skin. And so the two of them were wed, and they were a very happy couple. And they had 7 children. They had 4 boys and 3 girls. And they said that there was no finer looking children in all the Broken Isles of Orkney than those Selkie bairns. Now the woman herself often looked sad and had a faraway look on her eyes. And many times she would go down to the shore by herself and she would sit on the banks and she would look over the sea. And sometimes a big male seal would rise up out of the water and stare towards her. She would gaze at him as well before having to turn around and walk back home. Now, the years had passed and the children were growing up, and the man of Westness had taken the 3 eldest sons to go fishing with him. The mother had sent the other children down to the shore to gather bait, all except for the youngest girl, who had cut her foot and it had become infected. And she was sitting with her foot up on a stool. Now her mother was pretending to be cleaning the house, but really she was looking for her lost skin. And the child could see that, and she said, "What are you looking for, mother?" And she said, "Oh, don't tell, but I'm looking for a bonny skin to make a pair of rivellings for you to help to heal your foot." A rivelling was a shoe made of untanned hide. "Well," said the little girl, her face brightening, "maybe I know where there's a bonny skin." "Do you?" her mother said. "Yes, one day when Father thought I was sleeping, I saw him going up to the space above the wall of the house and the roof, just above the bed there, and he took down a beautiful silvery coloured skin, and he stared at it for a wee while and then he put it back." Well, as soon as the woman heard that, she ran over to the spot, she took down the skin, and it was her own missing, lost skin, the stolen skin. And she turned to her little child and she said, "Farewell to thee, Peerie Buddo." And she ran out the door and down to the sea, and she pulled on her skin, she dived into the water and swam away. And as she did so, a male seal came swimming towards her, and there was a joyful reunion between the two of them. Now, as they were swimming away, the man of Westness came around the corner of the headland in his boat, and she swam over to it, and she lifted the skin from her face, and she said, "Good man of Westness, farewell to thee. I liked you well, you were good to me, but I love far more my man of the sea." And with that, she pulled the skin down over her face, and the two seals dived down into the sea and were never seen again.
You can wait and wish, but it's all in vain. There's never much Lord wishing seems to do. You can only wish to be home again. There's never times for wishings to come true. But what's to stop us dreaming, dreaming while we're working? It's easy just to dream your life away on Shipless Bay.
The coast of the Fair Isle is the wildest and most unpitying that we have seen. Continuous cliffs from 1 to 400 feet high tower by huge voes and echoing caverns, line the bare downs with scarcely a curve of sand or a practicable cleft in the belt of iron precipices. At interval, it runs into strange peninsulas, square buff headlands and plumb faces of stone. So wrote Robert Louis Stevenson in 1870. Situated in a sea channel where current, wind and tide can create the most inhospitable of conditions, it is not surprising that, from ancient times, its coastline has become the graveyard of innumerable vessels. Occasionally a ship would be driven ashore by the tide in fine weather. In 1877, for example, the Black Watch was wrecked on Charleston and provided, among other things, internal doors complete with hinges, locks and porcelain handles for many of the houses on the isle. It must be said, however, that while the shipwrecked mariners and their government bodies often showed their gratitude for the bravery of the rescuers, ship owners and customs officers were somewhat less enthusiastic about the isle men's ability to utilise this particular harvest from the sea. El Gran Grifón, 650-ton flagship of Juan Gómez de Medina's squadron of hulks, was a commandeered merchantman built in Rostock. One of the Spanish Armada fleet, damaged in battle, her hull strained by the recoil of her guns and battered by storms. By the time she reached Fair Isle waters, she was in dire straits. One eyewitness described their ordeal. "When we thought all hope was gone, except through God and His Holy Mother, we sighted an island ahead of us. Though we saw we should still have to suffer. We anchored in a sheltered spot we found, this day of our great peril, 27 September 1588. It is thought that de Medina attempted to beach her at dawn the next day, but the tide took her south into Stromness. With the ship wedged firmly against the cliff, the men escaped by climbing the foremast, which lay against the overhang. 7 died in the attempt." The journal continues, "We found the island peopled by 17 households in huts, more like hovels than anything else. They are a savage people, whose usual food is fish, without bread, except for a few barley meal bannocks cooked over the embers of a fuel they use, which they make or extract from the earth and call turf. They have some cattle, quite enough for themselves. They depend on mainly milk and butter from their cows, using their sheep's wool principally for clothing. They are a very dirty people, neither Christian nor altogether heretic." Conditions on the isle left much to be desired. The native population was vastly outnumbered, and credit must be given to the castaways as, despite 50 of their number dying, mostly of starvation, they took nothing by force and paid for everything they got. After 6 weeks of stormy weather, the survivors were transported to the Shetland mainland. It was the beginning of December before they were landed in Anstruther, Fife, and well into the next year before they were repatriated. There is no contemporary recorded instance of belligerence by the islanders. Did the inhabitants have enough sense of self-preservation not to antagonise a superior and larger force? Not until many years later did tales of murder, mayhem, and the cosy exchange of dye recipes and knitting patterns appear, not from Spain or Fair Isle, but from writers and newspaper reporters based elsewhere. In 1593, a contract was signed between Patrick Stewart, Earl of Orkney, and William Irvine, that the said William should address himself with all speedful diligence into Fair Isle, there be all means possible shall win the ordnance that was in the Spanish ship. By 1728, rumours of treasure on board convinced Jacob Roe to try his luck, but the loss of a man and news of a more profitable wreck elsewhere shortened his visit. In 1970, a team from St Andrews University, led by Dr. Colin Martin, mapped the site and raised cannon, shot and lead ingots, but found only one coin.
Greetings everyone from the deep dark woods of Slovenia, where the moss grows and the ivy grows and big trees and everything is green and beautiful. I'm going to sing you a song today that's called Jerca je šla po vodo, or Jerca went to fetch water, a traditional ballad about a young lass that is kidnapped by a water-sprite. So he takes her, when she is at the loch fetching water, he takes her down to his underwater kingdom, marries her, and she bears them a son. And after a year, she gets terribly homesick. So she asks her husband if she can go and see her family for the one last time. Reluctantly at first, eventually he grants her her wish. So she goes back to see her family. And when it's time to go, she tricks him into putting big stones in his big straw basket where she was supposed to be. And when he reaches the shores of a loch, he realizes that she has tricked him, and he gets terribly upset and his heart broke. Traditional ballad does not say anything about that, but a traditional folk tale on which the ballad is based does. So, without further ado, here is Jerca je šla po vodo. Jerca je šla po vodo, a je več nazaj ni bilo, pa je več nazaj ni bilo. Vzel jo je ta dolgi mož, pelujo je pod vodo, pelujo je pod vodo. Vsaka nevesta v goste gre, šla bom tudi, Jerca jaz, šla bom tudi, Jerca jaz. Ne hodi po ta široki pot, tam kjer furman furajo, tam kjer furman furajo. Hodi potahovský pút, tam, kjer se rasejo, tam, kjer se rasejo, tam, kjer se rasejo, jen močno precvetajo, jen močno precvetajo.
1868, Lessing. A barque from Bremen bound for New York on her maiden voyage and carrying 20 crew and 451 emigrants, among them 69 children and 27 babies. On 23rd May, the captain, C.J. Gerdes, in thick fog, but believing he was well to the west of the isle, was running under sail when the vessel drove straight into Klaverskia, wedging herself firmly in the mouth of the Geo. The ship's boats launched over the starn were broken up by the swell. Cries for help were heard in the nearest houses, and soon the whole isle was alerted. With no possibility of rescue from seaward, the yawls were carried across the isle and lowered down to the beach at Heswells. On the south side of Klaverskia there is a high, narrow promontory with a low, natural heeler near its junction with the land. Entry was extremely hazardous, with the surge of the waves threatening to smash the yawls on the roof of the arch. But once through, they found themselves in comparatively still water. Repeated trips brought all to shore to be guided or carried up the cliff and taken to shelter. No lives were lost. At the time, the isle had a population of 220, living in 28 turf-roofed houses. By evening, every house, along with any comparatively wind and watertight building, was full. Makeshift tents were constructed using sail from the wreck. Food was scarce. In May, winter stores would be almost gone. Rice salvaged from the wreck was cooked over open fires and eaten using limpet shells as spoons. Word was sent to Shetland, and a rescue vessel succeeded in transferring all the passengers and crew to Lerwick by the 3rd of June. After being billeted in Fort Charlotte, they were all returned to Bremen, where they again boarded an emigrant ship. By Christmas they had safely reached New York. A consortium of Kirkwall merchants bought the wreck and had it towed to Kirkwall. An advert in the Orkney Herald of Tuesday the 4th of August 1868 tells us that the great attraction of the forthcoming Lammas Fair is to be the sale of goods from the Lessing. Along with serious quantities of woolen fabrics, socks, stockings and gloves, fancy work baskets of all sorts, sails, wood and cabin fittings, there was advertised, and I quote, "an endless variety of the most superb china and other toys of every description, useful, ornamental and instructive, available for the nursery, mantelpiece or drawing room, chaste, classic and of exquisite workmanship and material." A reward of £100 was given to Fair Isle by the German government, and a scheme of division was drawn up by John Bruce, who owned the isle, listing all the men and boys who took part in the rescue. In July 1869, the widows and spinsters signed a petition pleading their case for equal rights. They stressed that the award was to the inhabitants, that they had carried children from the shore to safety and given up their beds to the detriment of their health. Their final point was unequivocal, that the administrative authority, vested in yourself in dividing the money, being generously delegated to the male portion of our sea-girt isle, saw fit in their wisdom to cut us off at a stroke. The justice of the case should allow our claim, or failing that, please tax the bachelors. The petition was signed by 45 isle women and girls. As was standard practice for the time, the only women who received a share were widows of men involved in the rescue. All those women who alone gave what they could received nothing.
An earthly Norris sits and sings,
and I, she sings, Balili win. Little can I, my bairnie's feather, or less the land that he bides in. He came one night to her bed feet, and a grumly guest, I'm sure was he, saying, here I am, thy bairnie's feather, although I may not comely be. I am a man upon the land, and I'm a Selkie in the sea, and when I'm far and far frae land, my hame it is in so Skerry. Then he has taken the purse of gold, and he had placed it upon her knee, saying, give to me, my little young son, and tuck thee up thy Norris feet. It shall come to pass on a summer's day, when the sun shines brightly on every stay, I'll tuck my little young son, and teach him how to swim the bay. And thou shalt marry a proud gunner, and a right fine gunner I'm sure he will be, and the very first shot he'll ever shoot will kill both my young son and me.
As is obvious from the map, the south end of the islet is particularly treacherous. All of the wrecks have their own stories. Here are a few of them. On 4th September 1876, as the Fair Isle fishing fleet returned to South Harbour, one of the yawls, the Hope, capsized. The wind and tide were severe, and the following yawls swept on past, but the yawl Eagle, which had been ahead of the stricken craft and had reached safety, turned back to attempt a rescue. In peril of their lives, the men and boys in the rescue vessel, although the sea made a passage over us, as they reported later, reached the upturned boat and with great difficulty rescued 2 of the 3 crew from the tide race. The third, Jerome Wilson, was lost, leaving a wife and 6 children. The witnesses on shore petitioned for recognition of the bravery displayed that day. In August 1877, Stuart Wilson Springfield, my great-grandfather, and John Wilson Taft were awarded Board of Trade bronze medals for gallantry. The two boys on board the rescue boat, one of them Jerome's son, were given 10 shillings each. During daylight hours on the 10th of November 1911, the Columbine left South Harbour with a cargo of livestock. It was a fresh southerly breeze, but the skipper, James Brown, headed east around the isle. Just off the Sheep Craig, the vessel took a heavy sea, inducing a severe lee roll, which resulted in one of the kai in the hold sustaining a broken neck. The dead animal in their midst panicked the rest of the beasts, and fearing they would break up and endanger the stability of the vessel, Brown returned to South Harbour and anchored. He and the crew went ashore, but the cattle were left on board. The next day, with the wind direction more southerly and a terrific sea running, the Islemen launched a yawl from Listed, boarded the cutter, and, at some considerable risk to their own lives, managed to free the trapped animals, hoisted them onto the deck and into the sea. Miraculously, men and beasts reached the shore without injury. Later that day, the waves became so deep that the Columbine struck the sea floor and was wrecked, without the anchor dragging at all. In 1915, the cutter Canadia drove aground. She was carrying supplies for Germany while flying a Danish flag, had been captured by the British Navy, and had a prize crew on board. She came in from the west on the 12th of March, a night of hard westerly wind and drizzle, and stuck on a bow, pivoting and bringing hard up on Healy Stack. She sent up some flares into the darkness. Crewed by enough men to double-bank the oars, the Isle rescue boat launched, but the state of the sea was such that it was impossible to get round the southwest end of the isle into the open sea. Some oars were broken in the attempt. 3 oars were carried to Hestigia, and from there volunteer crews did manage to reach the wreck, but could not get close because of the surf around her. The ship's crew, on advice from the Islemen, scrambled on to Healy Stack to wait out the night. When daylight broke, the crew were rescued by Breach's boy. No one was lost. Her cargo included sacks of flour and walnut for gun stocks. By the time customs officers reached the isle, said cargo had disappeared. Gunnels, meal chests, were full and stocks of wreckwood replenished and well hidden. 5 generations later, walnut from the Canadia is still cropping up in cradles and chairs. Over the centuries, we have gone from cogs to carriers, from topsail schooners to trawlers, tankers and pleasure craft. Forecasting and dead reckoning have moved from sky watching to satellite navigation. The backup of lighthouse, coastguard, lifeboat and air-sea rescue services make the oceans safer than they have ever been. Yet for all seafarers, the sheer power of wind and sea demands no less mettle today than when we first set sail. That power remains the dominant force, and as so often happened in the past, will always have the final say. Robert Louis Stevenson's observations still stand as the definitive one. The coast of the Fair Isle is the wildest and most unpitying that we have seen. Continuous cliffs from 1 to 400 feet high tower by huge voes and echoing caverns, line the bare downs with scarcely a curve of sand or a practicable cleft in the belt of iron precipices. At interval, it runs into strange peninsulas, square buff headlands, and plumb faces of stone.